So again, thank y'all
Thank
for having me. My name is Jackson-Truitt. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Education and Training over here in Institute Diversity. I've been at Georgia Tech for 10 years and I've run a series of recruitment and retention programs for transfer students, first gen students, minority students, women, etc. And so I became well versed in kind of what it takes to let these students feel as included as possible in classrooms. In my current role, I've been in this role about 2 years. I'm charged with kind of providing these best practices across the entire campus. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Jason, for the invitation. And so we'll just talk a little bit about what is this, inclusive classroom that we speak of. And I'll leave you with some tips on how to integrate inclusion into your classroom starting at the very first day. So what is this culture of inclusion? Some of the definitions I like are just very, very basic, right? It's creating and maintaining an inclusive classroom environment. It allows students from all backgrounds and all walks of life to reach their fullest potential. All students feel supported intellectually and academically, regardless of how they identify. And I'll talk about all the various identities our students are bringing to the table. What we find is that when faculty model inclusion from the very beginning, and they then carry it throughout the classroom and they encourage it actively, students actually do much better academically and socially. They feel more connected to their peers. They engage more, so the class feels like an engaged environment, and better retention. And that's what we all are looking for. So a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion, kind of separating those terms. So diversity talks about the identities that we all have, our race, gender, ethnicity, etc. Inclusion is making sure that each of those perspectives is valued, it's seen, it's included. And then equity, making sure we have equitable results and outcomes. Does everyone have the accommodations that they need? Are we making sure that everyone learns in a way that is best suited for them? So that's kind of the goal of all of this work, is to make sure that we have equitable outcomes from students, regardless of background, regardless of how they learn, regardless of all those identities. Because what we're doing is, of course, preparing them for this workforce of the future. So some of the identities that are obvious when we have these conversations is race, ethnicity, gender. We go deeper into, are they first generation or not? Socioeconomic status, are they legacy students? Are they older adult learners? Family status, do they have children? How they think, right? Is English their first language or not? So all of these things kind of combine to create all the identities that we need to be thinking about when we're teaching our students. So I'll highlight some things that get in the way of inclusion, and then I'll get into kind of some best practices and tips. The first one being implicit bias, is which lots and lots of us are trained around or know about or talk about. There's a lot of implicit bias trainings happening across campus and out in the world, but it can impact how we teach or how students treat each other. So what we know about implicit bias is that it's our thinking that happens at an unconscious level. They can be positive or negative, but they can contribute to discriminatory behavior. And so they're impacted by our earliest experiences, how we're raised, our experience with our mothers, which can lead us to make assumptions that women are more nurturing or better caretakers, certain biases in the culture where we live, so media images that we get of certain groups. If we're constantly inundated with images that this group is dangerous, or this group are terrorists, or that religious group is, scary for whatever reason. Or on the positive side, this is what doctors and engineers and computer scientists look like. Those subtle images that we're forced, that we're fed every single day through social media, TV, news, etc., do impact how we treat people, our actions, our behaviors, and it can be very, very under the surface. So here are the 6 major types. Here are ways that it can show up, and it can show up, when we're hiring people to work in our lab, or looking for new grad students, or as we recruit faculty. It can show up in all these places. And there's research around how it shows up for gendered names. what we perceive to be racial ethnic names on resumes, letters of recommendation. The research shows us that men and women, same role, same credentials when they're applying for positions, are described differently. And that is regardless of the gender of the letter writer. So that's just kind of deeper research around how it shows up. But here's some major types you may see or may be familiar with. So affinity bias, when we prefer people we have something in common with. So here at Tech, it may look like, oh, they went to my alma mater, they must be well suited for the job. Or they went to this place, so they must be well suited. Which then leads us to exclude a lot of other people who could also be well suited. Gender bias shows up quite a bit. You may see this in your classrooms. Who's in charge of what role? Who do we believe is better at technical things? Who do we see more of? If we see men overrepresented in certain majors and certain classrooms or subjects or research topics, then there could be an implicit bias that they are better suited, or certain ethnicities even. If they are overrepresented in certain majors, then the assumption can be that they're better suited or more competent at that. The halo bias, when we focus on one great positive characteristic while ignoring all the other things that may make someone less qualified. On the opposite side of that is horns bias. So we focus on one negative thing and ignore all the positive aspects. Beauty bias, similarity bias, all these things can show up in how we engage with our students or how they engage with each other. And that's what we're really here to emphasize is you may see some things, but I want you to feel empowered to interrupt some of these patterns. So the implicit bias to me is the thinking, but it manifests in these very small microaggressions. So microaggressions are kind of these very subtle, sometimes they're nonverbal, but they're a way to make people feel marginalized. And they can be delivered with best intentions. But the thing about implicit bias and microaggressions, it is not tied to your intentions, really. The outcome is that it can cause harm for the recipient. So as it accumulates over time, people who are constantly exposed to these microaggressions actually suffer some psychological harm. So there's a lot of anxiety, there can be some depression, it can lead to overcompensation. So perfectionist students, what they call type A, can be a result of having to prove that they belong in that space. So some of these obvious ones here, gender, whistling at a woman, making women, take the notes and not do the technical work, commenting on women's bodies, anything like that. Number 2, microassault. Lots of folks think that is the only microaggression, like an obvious racial or derogatory slur, but it can show up in lots of ways, and that's just one of them, the microassault. Number 3, microinvalidation, where we say, are you sure you're not just being sensitive? Or why are you so defensive? When you're invalidating and reducing someone's lived experience. 5, mimicking accents or making fun of people who maybe English is their second language. Those types of stereotypical comments or thoughts or sharing memes or, social media posts about certain groups is another version of microaggressions. Description of intelligence is really huge. And our students, when I do these conversations with students, a lot of the women or our Latinx population that may have a stronger accent, or some of our Black students or transfer students even, there's a lot of commentary around how'd you get here? Where did you come from? And oh, you got in here because of X. Oh, you got here because you're a woman. Oh, okay, that's why. Lots of ascription of intelligence. Who belongs in that room? Who does not belong in that room? Number 4, where are you from? And that question can go either way, right? So it can be an icebreaker, but there's lots of other ways to break the ice. Or it can be a way to kind of figure out what someone's doing here. A lot of assumptions behind that question. Number 7, some of those obvious statements. You don't sound like a Black person. You're really smart for a girl. All of those kind of comments and statements. And so this to me is a nice snapshot of some things that may happen, under the surface. It could be what our student experienced just before they came to class. And so a knowledge of this is how we begin to kind of become aware and then put some actions in place to mitigate and reduce. So I have a vignette, which is a common experience of students in classrooms. They talk about a lot around group work. and some of the anxieties that come along with that, especially if they're kind of in one of these underrepresented groups. So it can be, I'm one of 3 women in my class, or I'm one of 3 Black people or Hispanic people in my class, or any other identity that isn't the numerical minority. And so this is something I want folks to always be thinking about, because a lot of this happens right under our noses. Sometimes faculty don't feel empowered to do anything or intervene. And so I don't know that we have time to really chat about this, but I'd love you to use the chat box if you have ideas on what you would do, how you would redirect this, how you would intervene. And I'll just read this out loud for the benefit of the group. You're a faculty member for an undergraduate course that requires group work. You notice a trend that the female members of the group usually end up taking notes, designing the presentation, or doing other non-technical work, although you know they have a similar level of technical expertise as the men. And so I like to always pose this question, these types of examples, and see what people would do. How would you go about intervening and interrupting that? Or if you have no idea what to do, we can talk about that also. So use the chat and just talk amongst yourselves about some ideas on how to kind of correct that. So now we know what kind of gets in the way of an inclusive classroom, the microaggressions, those implicit biases, stereotyping, how we talk about people, how we talk to each other. And so now I'll provide some best practices on how to mitigate, reduce, and really build this inclusive classroom culture. So a lot of this begins even before the class starts, right? And so these are adapted from the Yale Teaching and Learning Center. And then the next one is from University of Central Florida. And I'll send all these links because they're really, really helpful. So before class starts, anticipate sensitive issues around any racial, class, or any other cultural differences. One thing that we do know is this past year has taught us a lot around systemic racism, the impacts of the pandemic on folks, anxieties about returning back, or anticipation, excitement about coming back together. But this student population is really steeped in kind of what's happening outside their doors, their classroom walls, and we can't act like it won't impact them. And so just becoming aware of what's happening. Some students talked about with the Asian American Pacific Islander violence that's happening, students coming into classroom settings and no one talking about it, and it was fresh and they felt afraid. But just being aware of what could be percolating under the surface for your students is the first step, just becoming aware of what they may bring with them. Solicit student feedback throughout the course. So you can do a pre-survey and just get to know them. Like, who are you? Where are you from? What should I know about you? How do you learn best? How can I support you? Those kind of questions to kind of get to know them before they even come in. A midpoint checkpoint survey. How's it going? Do you need any support in any areas? It can be the same questions. And then a post survey, just very minimal way to be interactive with your students outside of the classroom and show them that you're listening and you're kind of valuing them on a holistic level. Add a diversity statement to the syllabus. There are a lot of examples of these, and you can open with that. And it can just show that this classroom is a safe space. This is what I'm going to do to make sure that it's a safe space. And I'll show you a sample statement on the next slide. Examine your own implicit biases and then seek strategies to mitigate them. So there are lots of free tests you can take. The Harvard Implicit Association test is one that we point people towards. It's one of the most well-known. It's not a perfect test, but it can show you where your biases are. One thing we know about biases, you can have them against your own group. And so I've had faculty take that test that were maybe in their older 50s, 60s, 70s, and realize they had a bias against older folks. And so you can be in a group and still have biases against that group. And that is due to just being at a campus where we value like youth and innovation, that kind of coded language. And so you can have those own biases against yourself. So it will be interesting to see what you get, right, when you take this test, and then you can do some work to kind of mitigate that. Incorporate diverse perspectives into course content. This is huge. Identify researchers, perspectives, findings, from people from all kinds of different backgrounds, right? We can no longer just kind of have this one narrow worldview. We can find TED Talks and YouTube clips and apps that folks have developed. There's so many ways to integrate diversity into your curriculum and be very intentional about doing that. So here's a sample diversity statement that I think is really comprehensive, and I like this. This one's adapted from the University of Iowa College of Education. And I'll just highlight a few statements that I like that jumped out to me. So it talks about the professor's intent that students from all backgrounds and perspectives are well served in the course, learning needs are addressed in and out of class, and that diversity that students bring to the class is a resource, a strength, and a benefit. I love that phrase. I like this phrase also around your suggestions are encouraged and appreciated. Let me know ways to improve the effectiveness of the course for you or other students. And if anything conflicts with your religious events, let me know so we can make arrangements. So that's just a sample statement that I think really points at various identity groups, makes folks feel included from the get-go, and shows that you kind of have an ear or an open door policy around any of these things that come up. So it really sets the tone. These are things that you can do before class starts. And then this is what we need to be thinking about throughout the course. So earlier I talked about the pre, the midpoint, and the post survey. Here's some additional things. Making it personal. So getting to know students outside of the classroom. Not that you have to sit with them for hours in office hours, but find ways to kind of get to know who they are, right? So in that survey, it can be, tell me 3 things about you that you'd like me to know. Someone may have, I don't know, children, or they may have transferred in, or they may be an adult learner. They may have all kind of different identities that could be interesting to share with the class. That could be a way that you break the ice in that first session. People kind of going around round robin style, talking about who they are outside of just kind of like, hi, my name's Emily, computer science major. I'm from Florida. But kind of go deeper than that. Encourage small group collaborative work. So there is a way to do that doesn't feel like a competition. And mix those groups up, right? If you see people that are kind of on, again, those kind of minoritized groups often feel really awkward or left out. So make sure you're mixing up the groups, or people are finding ways to work in spaces and with people they wouldn't otherwise work with. But be on the lookout for any kind of biases or exclusion that's happening. Watch for problematic assumptions and biases from faculty and students. Again, this can come up in a very unintentional way when people are answering questions. Just be aware of those things. Demonstrate an appreciation for diverse people, cultures, perspectives. Again, that comes from you setting the tone from the very beginning, identifying diverse researchers and collaborators and such to add to your curriculum. And then modeling inclusive language, gender-neutral pronouns, for example, is one way to do that. And so I saw this and I thought this could be interesting as a kind of first day small group conversation starter. So people can get in small groups virtually or in person and answer these 5 questions and just kind of see if they have anything in common with other folks in the group, and they can report that out. So questions like, I learn best classes where the professor fill in the blank. Students and courses help me learn when they. I am most likely to participate in classes when. Here's something that makes it hard for me to learn in a course. Here's something that makes it easy to learn in a course. So again, hearing students, seeing where they are, trying to meet them there. And I know that we can't, provide, 50 different ways of teaching a course. But what I have learned from students is that they just want to feel heard, seen, appreciated, valued for who they are. Whether you can, change everything for them or not, it's about feeling included. So it's a feeling of inclusion. It's intentionality set from the faculty down and throughout, and setting the tone for how your course is going to go. And so I often have people who say, I need a little bit of information or training or resources. And so I'll point you to some links that are really helpful. They're free. You can take some of those. I'll be taking some of these this summer also. So the LGBTQIA Resource Center has a lot of safe space trainings and ally trainings and information on pronouns and how to make sure your syllabus is kind of appropriate and inclusive. This is external. I holla back. They do a lot of allyship trainings and bystander trainings, what to do if something comes up, if you see something, say something, how to intervene, how to have those courageous conversations, and a lot of resources here. So you may have students come to you and say, I'm experiencing this, or I feel some anxiety around this identity. So there's resources here for every possible identity group where you can just say, hey, I may not have all the answers, but let me point you towards some folks who do, and let me know how else I can support you. Just being a listening ear often is really helpful. And then you may want to take it a step further, right? So suppose, you really see something that really raises to the attention and you've got to intervene on the spot. Here's some tangible ways to do that. So if you hear something in a group or, some inappropriate comments are being made, you can interrupt and say, hey, that's not appropriate in this classroom. We're not doing that. Or it sounded like you weren't letting her speak. Let's make sure that she had a chance to finish her comment, and then we'll come back to you. Interrogate can look like, hey, so you made a joke earlier. What did you mean by that? What does that mean? What makes you say that? Why is that funny? Pushing back. Educating folks, hey, you may not be aware, but that is an offensive statement. So just want to make sure that you're aware that may not be your intention. Advocating for people, so who's not in the room, who doesn't have a voice, or whose kind of voice is being minimized. Advocating and calling them in and making sure that they can feel comfortable to speak. And then apologize. If something happens, you may have made a mistake. This happens to everyone, the best of us with the best intention. Apologizing. Hey, I didn't realize it was Ramadan and I think I scheduled something. So if you need a little extra time, let me know. Just being open and aware and open to change and open to being an ally and constantly doing the work to learn how to best support your students. And then finally, some campus resources. So there's some professional development, of course, coming out of the provost's office. There's a lot of courses that they're working on around these inclusive classrooms out of Janice Stone's and Brandy Simula's work on campus. Conflict resolution, if there's some deeper conflicts that folks need help resolving, you can point them in that direction. Sexual harassment, a student may come and disclose to you that something happened in the class or elsewhere in the world. Point them here and make sure that they report and that they follow through. And then any issues around racial or ethnic discrimination or harassment, ethics point is an option and a resource. Point people there. Often people don't know where to go, or students just tell their faculty and think that's the end. But I want everyone to kind of be aware that there are resources on campus that will support you and will support your students if you need them. And then finally, a link to the Harvard Implicit Association test I mentioned could be an interesting way to kind of see where you are. We have other trainings and courses for faculty, staff, and students. So feel free to point them here to this link. And then a ton of resources around all these topics, right? So you don't have to be a subject matter expert, but we want you to know that you kind of have a hub of information you can always refer to. So here we have TED Talks and short little clips around all of these kind of diversity, equity, inclusion topics in bite-sized pieces that you can kind of digest. So feel free to peruse that at your convenience. And then contact me, right? If things, something happens or you have additional questions, you want to go deeper into some of these concepts, let me know. I'd be happy to be a resource. And so I think that's my time. Any